mid-April 1943. The rain on Guadalcanal came as it always did, sudden, heavy, and without apology. It rattled against tin roofs, turned red dust to syrup, and ran in rivulets beneath rows of wooden pallets where boxes of rations, drums of aviation fuel, and bright Coca-Cola crates stood in uneven ranks. To a casual eye, Kukum Field looked like a warehouse dropped into the jungle. To the few men inside the operations hut, it was something else entirely, a front-line node in a war that could pivot on a single piece of paper. That paper lay inside a plain envelope, no larger than a man's hand, stamped confidential. It was the decoded form of a Japanese message. Magic decrypt NTF 131755, intercepted by American Signals Intelligence. The words on it were spare, almost bureaucratic, but they drew a precise map of an enemy leader's life and death. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, would depart. Rabaul at 0600 hours on the 18th of April, in a twin-engine Betty bomber, to visit forward bases at Balali and Buin. His schedule, his route, and even his estimated arrival times were all written out with the fatal neatness of a timetable. Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher of the Navy and Major John W. Mitchell of the Army Air Forces read the decrypt in silence. Neither man said the name magic. To do so was to risk the code system itself. Instead, they spoke around it, in the shorthand of officers used to balancing precision against peril. "We can reach him," Mitscher said finally, "but barely." Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, tapped the map spread across the rough wooden table. The problem was simple arithmetic written on a globe. From Guadalcanal to Bougainville and back was nearly 1,000 miles too far for any single-engine fighter except the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and even that only if it could drink more gasoline than its designers had imagined. "If we can hang one 165-gallon tank on one wing," Mitchell murmured, "and a 330-gallon ferry tank on the other, then we might make it." The larger tanks were rare, sitting in depots on New Guinea. They would have to be flown in immediately, lashed to transports and hustled through weather that ate airplanes for breakfast. Outside, a truck bounced past the hut, its cargo bed rattling with bottles in wooden crates. A corporal yelled something about cokes for the line shack, and laughter trailed behind him. None of the men inside the hut looked up. The noise of supply was the camouflage of secrecy. By dusk, word had travelled through channels as quietly as an electric current. Orders were signed for a special mission, requiring absolute radio silence and non-disclosure. The cover story was already written. Coast watchers had reported a senior Japanese officer touring Bougainville. No one outside the small circle at headquarters would ever hear the word decrypt. The real weapon, the one that could cross oceans without leaving a trace, was intelligence itself. Night on Kukum Field smelled of oil, wet canvas, and coffee gone bitter from reheating. In the hangars, maintenance crews worked under hooded lanterns, bolting the new tanks beneath the Lightning's silver wings. The long ferry tanks looked absurdly large, drooping like swollen bellies, but the calculations demanded them. Mechanics checked the fuel lines twice, then safety wired the fittings as though faith depended on torque. To the side of the runway, Coke bottles clinked again, a background symphony of the American war effort. Mitchell walked the line of aircraft with a clipboard under his arm and a Navy compass in his hand. It had been lent by a destroyer captain who said, "If you're going to navigate 1,000 miles of ocean, you'll need something that doesn't lie." The compass would purse, be lashed to the cockpit frame of his P-38, a talisman against magnetic drift and bad luck. He stopped at the leading edge of one Lightning and rested his palm on the cool aluminum. The paint was still speckled from salt spray, the name Miss Virginia faint beneath the grime. Somewhere in the darkness, a generator coughed to life. The hum was steady, confident the sound of an airfield preparing for something monumental, yet pretending it was routine. Inside the briefing tent, a map of the Solomon Islands lay under a single bulb. On it, a grease pencil line traced a route south of the normal patrol lanes, out from Guadalcanal, across the Solomon Sea, then northwest, in a long dogleg that would bring the formation up the coast of Bougainville unseen. The pilots would fly at wave-top height to avoid radar and visual detection, climb to altitude only at the last minute, and strike the Admiral's aircraft within a window of less than 10 minutes. Miss the timing and they would find only empty sky. Mitchell's voice carried evenly as he briefed his men. "We're not going there for a dogfight. We're going there to keep a promise made in Washington. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every minute of flying time is counted for this." He paused, letting the weight of secrecy fill the room. "If anyone asks what we're doing, you tell them it's a reconnaissance sweep. That's all." One of the younger pilots, his flight suit still too crisp, whispered to another that he'd never flown over open ocean that far. The older man just shrugged. "Nobody has," he said. "That's the point." Outside, the rain returned. It fell on the parked aircraft, on the crates of Coca-Cola stacked near the mess tent, on the signal tower, and on the jungle beyond the perimeter, where frogs and cicadas carried on their indifferent chorus. In the half-light, the base looked like any other forward camp: mud, metal, and motion. No one would have guessed that. Among the fuel drums and soda crates lay the thread that connected to the beating heart of the Imperial Navy. Dawn, the clouds broke enough for the horizon to show a thin line of silver. Ground crews pushed the Lightnings into position, their twin booms glistening with dew. Pilots strapped in, checked mixture controls, throttles, and gun safeties. Each man carried a sealed envelope containing his own coordinates and the order not to open it until airborne. When the first engines turned over, the sound rolled across the field like distant thunder. It mingled with the hiss of surf beyond the trees and the faint music of bottles knocking together in a mess truck. By the time the 18th engine fired, the noise was a promise made of metal. Mitchell climbed into his cockpit and settled the Navy compass in front of him. He adjusted his goggles, glanced once at the horizon, and gave the signal. The Lightnings began to move, heavy with fuel, each one kicking up its own halo of dust. As they lifted off, the sun cleared the ridge and set their wings ablaze in white light. From the ground, they looked like a single silver thread unwinding toward the north. The mechanics watched until the sound faded into the distance, then turned back to their work. A corporal pried open a crate and handed out bottles. The glass clinked softly. "To the boys up there," someone said. No one in that moment could see the irony that beneath the casual rhythm of ordinary life, beneath the hum of machinery and the sweetness of a soft drink shipped from home, lay the deadliest secret of the Pacific War. Intelligence had been hidden in plain sight, folded between inventories and shipping manifests, disguised by the smell of gasoline and sugar. The true weapon of Guadalcanal was not forged from steel or TNT. It was the ability to make the extraordinary disappear among the ordinary. As the last engine note faded beyond the palms, the base settled into its usual rhythm clerks sorting. Papers, mechanics cursing stuck bolts, cooks calling breakfast. The envelope with its decoded message rested again in the safe, invisible as air. And outside, under the gathering heat, the Coca-Cola crates waited in neat red rows, holding not bottles but the camouflage of normalcy. No one yet knew that, in less than 2 days, those quiet stacks would stand as witnesses to an invisible victory, one written first on paper, then in the thunder of 18, lightnings cutting north through the dawn. Dawn of April 17th, 1943. The first light found Guadalcanal wrapped in mist, the jungle steaming, and the runway a glimmering strip of mud and metal. Mechanics had been awake through the night, faces streaked with oil and rain, tightening the last bolts on the Lockheed Lightnings that crouched like silver insects in the half-dark. Every aircraft wore a mismatched pair of tanks, one 165-gallon and one 330-gallon, an asymmetry that made the airplanes look lopsided, but it was the only way the math worked. Major John W. Mitchell moved from plane to plane with a clipboard under his arm and exhaustion written across his jaw. He had not slept. None of them had. At his side, Lieutenant Besby Holmes carried a folded chart, the dog-eared paper showing a route no one else on Earth yet knew. It began at Guadalcanal, curved far to the south into empty ocean, then swept back in a long ascending arc to Bougainville, the strangest, loneliest flight path ever drawn. "We'll come in from below the sun," Holmes said, tracing the curve with one finger. "If the clouds hold, they'll never see us." At 0500, the pilots gathered in the operations tent, the air inside thick with cigarette smoke and sweat. The map on the wall was covered in coloured pins. Each pin represented a man who might not return. Mitchell spoke without ornament. "This is a one-way invitation," he said. "We go low and fast, no radio, no chatter, no mistakes. The target is moving on time, and that means we must move on time. If your watch is off by a second, fix it now." A dozen men pulled back their sleeves in unison and adjusted their watches. Outside, the hum of generators grew louder. Fuel trucks hissed, topping off the tanks until the wings sagged slightly under the weight. A stray dog loped between the landing gear, tail low, startled by the smell of metal and thunder. Near the hangar, a supply truck rattled by carrying crates of Coca-Cola toward the mess area. The bottles clinked together with a cheerful indifference that mocked the tension in the air. Few of the men noticed. They were busy loading ammunition belts, 8 Browning machine guns per aircraft, 4 in each wing, 3,000 rounds in total. At 0600, the first propeller turned, then another. The twin booms of the lightnings shimmered in the thin sun, their blades slicing the mist into glittering dust. One by one. 18 P-38s rolled down the pierced steel runway and leapt into the air. They formed a rough diamond, settling into an altitude no higher than the treetops. To anyone standing on the ground, they vanished within moments, swallowed by the shimmer of heat above the sea. The formation skimmed the water at less than 100 feet, engines tuned to a slow, deep growl. The ocean below was so close that propeller wash carved twin furrows into its surface. Pilots could see flying fish startled into the air and the shadows of their own planes gliding across the waves. To their left lay the Solomon Chain's small green scars on blue water, and to their right, nothing but horizon. Every half hour, Mitchell checked his compass, the Navy model fixed to his instrument panel. It was steady as faith, a circle of brass and magnetism that pointed north while his nerves pointed elsewhere. He glanced at the stopwatch strapped to his thigh. The numbers worked. The world held its shape. For the first 2 hours, the flight was silence and vibration. Then the weather changed. A bank of cloud ahead began to tower, white columns rising from the sea. "Climb through it," Mitchell ordered over the radio, breaking the long quiet. They rose just enough to clear the top of the storm, wings slicing into sunlight, then dropped again until the altimeter needle brushed the edge of danger. The P-38s were heavy with fuel, and any misstep meant the ocean. Behind Mitchell's lead element, Lieutenant Rex Barber kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had flown hundreds of miles of nothing, but he trusted the math more than intuition. Somewhere ahead, another man, a Japanese admiral who had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was flying on his own schedule, reading his own watch. 2 intersecting paths of precision, one drawn in secrecy, the other in pride. They would meet at the minute hand. By 0940, Bougainville appeared as a smudge on the horizon, dark green and gold in the morning light. The formation broke into 2 groups. The top cover of 12 Lightnings climbed to 15,000 feet, while the killer section of 4 stayed low, throttles forward, hearts hammering. They crossed the coast near Moyler Point and turned toward the jungle ridge called B340 on the charts. There was still no sign of the enemy formation, only scattered clouds and the endless hiss of engines. The pilots checked their watches again, 0944, 0945, on schedule. The sea below shimmered. Mitchell's voice came calm and low. "Keep your eyes open, he's out there." Back on Guadalcanal, the field had already settled back into the hum of routine. Mechanics cleaned tools. Clerks sorted manifests. A cook stirred powdered eggs in a dented pan. The crates of Coca-Cola were stacked neatly beside the mess tent, condensation glistening on the bottles. No one on that base knew what was unfolding 400 miles. away, or that inside those harmless crates and shipments lay the concealment of the greatest ambush of the Pacific Air War, an operation born from mathematics, secrecy, and the invisible ink of intercepted code. Above Bougainville, the lightnings continued their climb, engines roaring in thin air. Below them, the jungle glittered like scales. Mitchell's voice came over the radio, steady as a metronome. 5 minutes to intercept. Get ready. The men tightened harnesses, adjusted gun sights, and checked fuel. They had been flying for more than 4 hours, yet the war waited ahead in seconds. In another 5 minutes, they would see 2 tiny dots in the distance, 2 green-grey bombers and their escorts slicing through the sky on an admiral's perfect schedule. In that moment, history would draw its breath. The long reach of 18 lightnings, born in silence, would meet its purpose. And the secret weapon that had lived unnoticed among crates and papers on Guadalcanal would reveal itself not as a machine or a bomb, but as a calculation carried faithfully across 1,000 miles of sky. 0945, April 18th, 1943. Over the emerald coast of Bougainville, the morning haze began to lift. The American formation, 18P-38 Lightnings, slipped through the high air like glints of metal against cloud. Each pilot could feel the fatigue in his shoulders from 4 hours of tension, the steady vibration of propellers that had become the pulse of destiny. Ahead lay the sea channel near Kahili, where Japanese navigation charts marked a narrow corridor of flight. Mitchell checked his wristwatch 0946 and spoke only once. "We're early. Hold altitude." His voice was low, even. The others acknowledged with clicks of the radio, tiny sparks of discipline in an ocean of silence. They had one chance to meet the invisible timetable encoded on that fragile sheet of decrypted paper. Below, the jungle of Bougainville glowed in the morning sun. Coconut palms bent inland under the sea wind. Fishermen on distant reefs would later report the strange sight, silver twin-tailed aircraft sliding northward, barely above the horizon, soundless in the humidity. Then, at 0953, Lieutenant Rex Barber caught sight of movement. 2 dark specks, tiny at first, gliding along the coast at 2,000 feet. "There they are," he whispered into his throat mic. 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, their light green camouflage distinct even at distance, escorted by 6 Zero fighters weaving above and behind. Mitchell's words came through calm as arithmetic. "Confirm sighting. All units attack." The lightnings broke formation. From 15,000 feet, they rolled into steep dives, throttles wide open. The sound returned to the Pacific, the deep, rising thunder of turbocharged engines in descent. The Japanese formation, unaware, continued its stately course. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the right-hand seat of the lead bomber, reading reports, his gloved hands resting on a clipboard. His pilot, Lieutenant Mitsuo Koyanagi, scanned the altimeter and horizon, seeing nothing but peace. Barber and Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier Jr. came in from opposite sides, crossing paths like blades. Tracers flared in the sunlight. The first Betty shuddered, smoke blossoming from its right wing. Barber's rounds had found the fuel tanks. In the cockpit, Koyanagi tried to climb, but the heavy bomber staggered, the right engine ablaze. Seconds later, its wing tore free. The aircraft flipped, nose down, and plunged into the jungle below in a sheet of flame. Yamamoto, still strapped in his seat, was killed instantly. Lanphier, twisting through the formation, turned his guns on the trailing bomber. He fired a burst that ripped across its fuselage, sending panels spinning away. The second Betty veered left, trailing fire, before crashing into the trees near Moyla Point. 2 of the 6 escorting Zeros dove in pursuit, but the Americans were already climbing away, their dive speed carrying them through a wall of lead. Lieutenant Besby Holmes banked hard to avoid collision, saw smoke rising through the canopy, and muttered, "He's down, he's down." For a long second, the radio was silent. Then Mitchell's voice, "All aircraft, regroup and exit. Maintain heading 180. Time 0958. They turned south, throttles eased, the roar fading into a disciplined hum. No one spoke for several minutes. The shock of success of having struck the nerve center of the Imperial Navy with nothing more than mathematics and courage had not yet sunk in. Behind them, Japanese search planes were already circling over the crash sites. Later reports from ground troops described the scene: the twisted remains of a twin-engine bomber, the smell of burned fuel, and the body of an officer in a white uniform lying beneath the trees, still strapped in his seat harness, his pistol holstered. It would take them a full day to identify him. At 10:30, the lightnings reached open water. Clouds gathered again, and rain began to fall in sheets that drummed against the wings. Mitchell glanced at his fuel gauges, needles trembling just above empty. The gamble of range and endurance now demanded its price. "Ease back on throttles," he called. "Mixture lean. Hold your course." Each pilot calculated survival by instinct. At that altitude, with one engine throttled back, they could stretch every remaining gallon. The long tanks sloshed like ballast. Mitchell looked out over the ocean, the horizon indistinct. "We've done it," he whispered to no one. Hours later, as the coastline of Guadalcanal rose from the haze, the first aircraft staggered in on fumes. One by one, the lightnings touched down on the muddy runway, tires throwing water in long arcs. Ground crews ran out, waving, faces uncomprehending. To them, it was just another patrol returning home. When Mitchell climbed from his cockpit, he said nothing. He handed his clipboard to the intelligence officer and walked straight to the operations hut. Inside, the same plain envelope lay in the safe, its decoded message already obsolete. The mission had lasted 430 minutes. The cost: none lost in combat, one plane damaged, one history altered. At dusk, the clouds broke again, and the field glowed gold in the dying light. Mechanics uncapped bottles of Coca-Cola from the same crates that had stood beside the fuel drums since the day before. They drank, laughed, unaware of what had been achieved beyond the horizon. Only a few men in that hut knew the truth that the contents of a single coded message, hidden in the paperwork of a field cluttered with soda and supply, had rewritten the balance of the Pacific. The weapon had not been the machine guns of the lightnings nor the fuel in their tanks. It had been intelligence concealed, protected, and delivered under the most ordinary disguise imaginable. Somewhere out over Bougainville, the smoke still rose in thin, black threads against the afternoon sky, marking the spot where the architect of Pearl Harbor had met the invisible reach of American calculation. The thunder had struck, and the sky itself had kept the secret. The jungle of Bougainville swallowed wreckage the way the sea swallows light. By mid-afternoon on April 18, 1943, search aircraft from the 8th Base Force at Kahili circled over the green canopy where smoke still rose in a thin, oily pillar. Naval landing parties hacked their way inland through heat thick as syrup, guided only by smell and the sound of insects drawn to burned metal. What they found stopped them in silence. The lead Betty bomber lay broken across a clearing carved by its own fall. The wings were sheared, the engines buried in mud, the fuselage gutted by fire. Yet one section of the cockpit remained strangely intact. In it sat a man still strapped to his seat, his white gloves unstained, his head bowed as if in contemplation. The identification tag confirmed what every sailor already feared: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. His pistol rested at his hip, a ceremonial katana lay across his knees, scorched but unbroken. Lieutenant Hamasuna, the medical officer accompanying the recovery team, recorded in his field notes that the Admiral had suffered 2 wounds, one to the jaw, another to the shoulder, either instantly fatal. The body was lifted out with improvised dignity, wrapped first in a parachute silk shroud, then placed beneath a canvas awning of palm leaves. As the rain began again, the sailors stood bareheaded, murmuring prayers from memory. The jungle dripped and steamed around them like a cathedral. Far to the south, on Guadalcanal, the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron landed to routine indifference. Their debriefing was brief and bloodless. The words Admiral Yamamoto never appeared on the typed report, only 1 twin-engine bomber destroyed, 1 probable. The pilots were ordered to speak of Coast Watcher intelligence and nothing more. The true origin of the mission, the invisible lattice of decrypts and analysis known only as magic, was folded back into the vaults of Pearl Harbor. Major John W. Mitchell wrote a single line in his log. Mission completed, no losses. He did not mention the body that now lay beneath a tarp 500 miles away, nor the storm already gathering in Tokyo. History, for the moment, would remain classified. At Rabaul, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki waited through the night for the scheduled radio call that never came. When reports finally arrived from search planes, they were vague. One aircraft missing, believed down on Bougainville. Ugaki refused to release the news until verification. At dawn on the 19th, a destroyer dispatched from Shortland brought boat confirmation. The message transmitted to Imperial General Headquarters read simply, His Excellency Admiral Yamamoto died in action. Tokyo learned the truth on April 20th. The announcement drafted by the Navy Ministry framed the loss as martyrdom. While directing operations in the southern area, the Commander-in-Chief met heroic death in aerial combat with the enemy. Newspapers printed the story with black borders. Schoolchildren bowed in silence. Yet within staff circles, disbelief hardened into dread. Yamamoto had been the architect of Pearl Harbor, the symbol of Japan's far-reaching arm. His death proved that the enemy's arm was longer still. American radio operators monitored the Japanese broadcast that evening. On Guadalcanal, Mitchell gathered his men and read the translation aloud. No cheers followed, only a kind of still respect. Lieutenant Rex Barber sat on a crate of Coca-Cola bottles outside the operations tent and said quietly, "We did what we were told to do." The bottles clinked as he lifted one. The carbonation hissed in the heat, sounding like the ocean retreating over gravel. For weeks afterward, the true story remained hidden even from those who had flown it. Intelligence officers collected their maps, erased markings, and sealed mission files under new reference numbers. The words Operation Vengeance appeared only later, when historians pieced together what had happened between the morning mist and the evening rain. In Japan, the funeral ceremonies stretched for days. The ashes of Yamamoto were placed in a lacquered urn, carried through streets lined with silent citizens. Emperor Hirohito bestowed posthumous honors Fleet Admiral, First Order of the Golden Kite, and the newspapers printed photographs of cherry blossoms falling over the hearse. Yet behind the pomp, the combined fleet trembled. Pilots who once boasted of air superiority now spoke of American range and precision with unease. The myth of invincibility had died with the Admiral beneath those palms. The Americans, bound by secrecy, could not claim public credit. The newspapers in New York and Chicago reported only that a high Japanese official had been killed in air combat somewhere in the Solomons. No names, no details, no hint of the invisible mathematics that had guided 18 lightnings across 1,000 miles of ocean. The pilots went back to routine sorties, their aircraft rearmed, their minds heavy with the knowledge of what they could not say. In May, 2 intelligence officers from Washington arrived unannounced at Kukum Field. They carried a small wooden chest, the sort used for tools or documents, but this one bore a label stenciled Coca-Cola Export Corporation. Inside were duplicate mission records, sealed film canisters, and the recovered shell casings from Barber's guns evidence to be stored away from rumor. The chest was shipped north under ordinary cargo paperwork, hidden once again amid the mundane traffic of war. The secret weapon remained what it had always been, information disguised as everyday life. As June approached, the rainy season deepened. The runway at Kukum turned to red clay, and the jungle reclaimed the edges of the base. The wooden crates stacked beside the mess tent grew darker with mildew, their painted logos fading in the damp. No one remembered to move them. Yet, somewhere inside those boxes of ordinary glass bottles and faded labels lay the echo of the mission, the reminder that power could wear the face of the familiar, that victory might arrive wrapped in the color of home. In the Pacific twilight, the sound of P-38 engines fading toward another patrol blended with the distant hiss of the tide. None of them spoke of the Admiral. The jungle had taken him, the sea had hidden their path, and the crates around them kept their own quiet secret, that the deadliest strike of the war had been born not from bombs, but from paper, patience, and the disguise of the ordinary. By late April 1943, Guadalcanal had returned to its familiar rhythm: mosquitoes, humidity, and the constant drone of machinery. The mission that had changed the balance of the Pacific no longer existed on paper. Orders had been burned, notes retyped, logs rewritten. What remained was silence, and the silence weighed heavier than glory. Major John W. Mitchell sat alone in the operations hut one evening, watching rain collect along the seams of the tin roof. On his desk lay a clean flight log, new pages, no mention of April 18th. Intelligence officers had insisted the entries be reconstructed, omitting any reference to Admiral Yamamoto or the intercept coordinates. What appeared instead was bureaucratic camouflage, routine patrol, northern Solomons sector, no significant contact. In war, truth was another item subject to supply control. Outside, the field was alive again with ordinary activity. The same trucks rattled past, the same Coca-Cola crates clinking behind them. The familiar noise was both comforting and cruel. It reminded Mitchell how easy it was for the extraordinary to vanish under the noise of the ordinary. The real war, he knew now, was fought not only with guns but with secrecy, the discipline to erase triumph and carry on as if nothing had happened. Rex Barber and Besby Holmes shared a tent near the flight line. They spent their evenings smoking in silence, writing letters they could not explain. "We got the bastard," Barber whispered once, then laughed without joy. "And nobody can know." Holmes nodded, flicking ash into a tin can. "Maybe that's what winning feels like: nothing." They both stared into the dark where the jungle began, listening to the insects rise and fall like static on a radio. 2 days later, the first rumors began to drift through the enlisted ranks. The Japanese were broadcasting something an admiral lost in action. The scuttlebutt spread through the mess line, from mechanic to cook to driver. Someone claimed to have heard Tokyo Rose on shortwave, saying that Yamamoto had fallen gloriously in battle. The men didn't cheer, they simply looked at one another with quiet certainty. "That was us," one mechanic said softly, and the others nodded, then went back to work. At intelligence headquarters, the secrecy deepened. The magic decrypt team sent encrypted orders to Washington confirming the mission's success, using neutral phrasing so dry it bordered on parody: objective achieved, flight operations normal. In the code rooms, where young women in headphones translated numbers into words, no one knew what those words had cost. By May, the men of the 339th were rotated to new assignments under 13 Fighter Command. Their lightnings bore fresh serial numbers and new coats of dust, but the smell of salt and oil was the same. Each morning, they climbed into cockpits that had carried history and acted as if they were simply going up to patrol. The war demanded repetition: fly, refuel, repair, repeat. Memory was a luxury postponed until peace. In Tokyo, the Japanese Navy buried its grief beneath ceremony. Funeral trains moved through the capital with soldiers lining the tracks, their heads bowed. The newspapers called Yamamoto's death a noble ascent to the gods. Yet within staff meetings, the question that could not be printed hung in the air. How had the Americans known? Some suspected leaks. Others whispered about magic. None could imagine that their codes, those proud engines of precision, had already betrayed them. Back on Guadalcanal, a Navy photographer was ordered to destroy the negatives from April 18th. He hesitated before feeding the last strip of film into the flame. The image showed a single P-38 rolling into the sky, sunlight flashing across its propeller. Nothing in the frame hinted at what it carried, yet the photograph seemed to hum with meaning. When the emulsion caught fire, the light burned briefly against his face like the reflection of something sacred being unmade. Major Mitchell received a commendation written in cautious language. For leadership and navigation under hazardous conditions, there was no mention of the target or outcome. He folded the citation into his footlocker and never displayed it. It was never about medals, he told Barber years later. It was about a message that didn't belong to us. In June, the 330-gallon tanks, the ones that had made the impossible flight possible, were loaded back onto transports bound for New Guinea. The quartermasters logged them as surplus ferry equipment. None bore a mark of distinction. They had done their work and now vanished into supply like ghosts. When the rains came heavier in July, the Coca-Cola crates near the mess hall began to rot. The wood darkened, labels peeled away. One morning, a clerk pried one open to salvage bottles, and inside found a folded map used to wedge a bottle against breakage. It was an old operations map, Bougainville, Moyla Point, and the red line of the intercept route faintly visible beneath water stains. He handed it to a superior, who tore it up without looking twice. The paper fragments scattered across the mud, joining thousands of others. Years later, veterans would remember that smell, the mixture of rain, mud, and spilled soda, and the way the airfield always seemed to hum, even when engines were silent. Some swore they could still hear the thunder of twin engines somewhere beyond the horizon. For now, in the spring of 1943, all that remained was the quiet professionalism of men who had done the impossible and been told to forget. The jungle was already reclaiming the edges of Kukum field. Grass grew between the steel planks. Mosquitoes danced over puddles, the color of rust. Mitchell stood once more by the runway at dusk, watching a fresh patrol take off for another routine mission. The silhouettes of the lightnings rose into the orange sky, their twin tails cutting through the clouds like dividers across a map. He removed his cap, felt the warm wind, and whispered to himself, "The paper did this. Just paper." Behind him, a corporal loaded more Coca-Cola crates onto a truck bound for the docks. The bottles rattled and shimmered in the fading light like fragments of glass memory. Somewhere out there beyond the jungle, beyond the sea, the consequence of that paper still echoed. The Admiral was gone, but his death had proven something larger than vengeance. The secret weapon hidden in those crates, disguised as logistics and ordinary life, was not steel or sugar or flight. It was information, the quiet thunder of knowledge carried inside an envelope, waiting for men to listen. And though the world would not learn it for decades, on that rain-soaked island, the future of modern warfare had already been written by paper, patience, and silence. August 1943. The war moved north, away from Guadalcanal's rusting airstrips, but echoes of that April morning clung to the island like heat. The wrecked machinery still glittered in the grass, bent propellers, twisted struts, crumpled drums, all reminders that the Pacific did not erase what it consumed. It simply covered it with vines. Kukum Field still pulsed with the daily rhythm of war, trucks clattering, hammers striking sheet metal, engines testing their throats against the wind. To anyone passing through, it looked like routine. To those who had been there on April 18th, it was a monument disguised as monotony. Major John W. Mitchell was gone now, transferred to a staff post in New Georgia. Rex Barber had been promoted, his P-38 patched, repainted, and flying new sorties. Yet the airmen who had shared that long flight still carried something invisible. It was not pride, it was weight, the kind of weight that settles in the bones, the quiet knowledge that you have seen a hinge of history close and been forbidden to speak of it. In the mess tent, their conversations skirted the subject the way ships skirt reefs. They talked about engines, weather, and food rations, about the taste of canned peaches and the menace of malaria. But sometimes, in the stillness between storms, one of them would glance at the jungle and say, "Do you ever hear it?" The others would nod, understanding. The "it" was the sound of the lightnings that morning, the rolling, rising roar that had lived in their skulls ever since. The sound of thunder, not from weather but from intent. By then, the news of Admiral Yamamoto's death had fully saturated the world. American newspapers finally confirmed it in June, citing a successful interception without explanation. Families at home read the headline over breakfast, "Architect of Pearl Harbor Killed," and nodded in vague satisfaction. They did not know that the operation had been plotted in a sweltering hut behind a wall of soda crates, or that the message which made it possible had travelled from a code-breaker's desk in Hawaii through the cracked hands of mechanics who thought they were merely loading fuel. In Tokyo, the morning had turned to paranoia. The Imperial Navy's codebooks were replaced in haste, new encryption cycles were introduced, but no cipher could rebuild the faith that had been lost. Pilots in Rabaul spoke the Admiral's name with reverence and dread, saying the Americans must possess a sky spirit that whispered enemy movements to them. Japanese intelligence officers compiled reports, searching for leaks that did not exist. The truth that a small group of mathematicians in Pearl Harbor had mapped every hidden word remained beyond imagination. On Guadalcanal, the monsoon returned. Rain soaked the airfield until the pierced steel planking sank under the weight of puddles. The wooden Coca-Cola crates, now warped and darkened, were stacked against the supply tent as makeshift tables. Pilots rested their coffee cups on them, unaware that those same crates had once hidden the first flight orders for Operation Vengeance. The irony was complete. The most ordinary object on the island had sheltered the most extraordinary secret. In late August, an army photographer arrived to capture routine operations. He took pictures of mechanics cleaning guns, nurses loading supplies, and airmen lounging under the wings of their planes. One image, unplanned, caught a half-open crate with faded red lettering and a single P-38 in the background, its twin tails gleaming. The photograph, published years later, would become a symbol of the unseen war, intelligence wrapped in ordinariness, power hiding in plain sight. Rex Barber kept flying, but the mission stayed with him. In letters to his wife, he never mentioned the Admiral by name. He wrote instead about the sea, about how the horizon here feels endless, as if every mile hides another decision someone already made. The decision he meant was the one made in that operations hut, the choice to turn paper into thunder. By September, new aircraft arrived, sleek P-38Js, with improved engines and drop tanks that made 1,000-mile missions seem routine. The innovation that had once been improvised from scavenged parts and guesswork was now factory standard. The engineers at Lockheed called it progress. The pilots called it prophecy. The crates that had once held Coca-Cola were now burned for firewood, their paint bubbling, their usefulness finally consumed. No one remembered what had been stored behind them in April, but the sound remained. On still nights when the humidity hung like a curtain, men claimed they could hear distant engines, an auditory ghost rolling across the jungle hills. Some said it was only the wind moving through palm leaves. Others swore they heard twin props, in perfect unison, fading toward the north. To those who had been there, the sound was memory, proof that a mission so secret it could not be spoken had still carved itself into the air. Years later, historians would call Operation Vengeance the most precise manhunt ever flown. They would print maps, reproduce debriefing reports, and publish photographs of the wreckage. But none of those documents could capture what lingered in the hearts of the men who had done it, the combination of pride and grief that comes from changing the course of a war without permission to claim it. For them, the legacy was not medals or parades. It was the hum that never faded, the echo that outlasted the orders, the sound that stayed. On the last evening of his tour, Barber walked alone to the edge of Kukum Field. The sun was low, bleeding into the sea, the color of rust on aluminum. He kicked at the mud, picked up a bent propeller blade half buried near the runway, and ran his hand along its curve. The metal was cool, silent, obedient. Above him, a formation of newer lightnings climbed into the sky, their silhouettes splitting the horizon exactly as his had done months before. He saluted without thinking, then turned toward the supply area, where a final crate of Coca-Cola waited to be loaded onto a departing transport. The glass bottles caught the dying sunlight and flared gold. It occurred to him that every war had its relics, swords, rifles, medals, but this one's relic might just be a crate of soda, a box that had once hidden the coordinates of revenge. He smiled, shook his head, and whispered to the air, "Paper and thunder!" That's all it ever was. The wind carried the words across the field, mingling them with the low rumble of engines climbing east. Somewhere beyond the clouds, history was already writing its next chapter, but the men who had flown through that April morning would always hear only one sound, the heavy, holy roar of 18 lightnings rising out of silence. By the spring of 1944, Guadalcanal had become almost peaceful, an island of rust and memory. The front had moved westward to the Marianas, and what remained were airfields littered with history's leftovers, fuel drums filled with rainwater, empty ammunition boxes, and the silent hulks of once vital machines. The Coca-Cola crates, warped by tropical seasons, now served as stools or firewood. Few of the new arrivals knew that one of those crates had once concealed the papers that killed an admiral. The mission itself had already turned into a rumor. New pilots who landed at Kukum heard whispers of the lightning men who had flown so far north that they touched the edge of the map. No one quite knew the details. Some said the Americans had shot down Yamamoto's plane while he was still over the sea. Others claimed the admiral had lived for hours after the crash. The truth was still buried beneath classification markings and deliberate omissions. Even those who had been there began to doubt their own memories. Rex Barber, rotated home in February, found the silence more suffocating than combat. He had returned to Oregon, a decorated but uncelebrated man. The local paper called him one of our fine flyers in the Pacific, nothing more. He smiled for photographs, kissed his wife, and tried to sleep. But in the quiet of his small house, the hum of the P-38's twin engines filled his dreams like a heartbeat that refused to stop. He was not alone. Major John W. Mitscher, now stationed in Washington for staff duty, received a visit from a War Department officer who carried a sealed envelope. Inside was a memorandum stamped top-secret ultra-source material. The text was only 3 sentences. Do not discuss Operation Vengeance in public or private. Continue to deny any connection between magic intercepts and the mission. Mitchell folded it carefully, replaced it in the envelope, and locked it in his desk. His hands trembled as he did so, not from guilt, but from the weight of perpetual silence. Even in Tokyo, where Yamamoto's shrine received daily offerings, the story had been altered beyond recognition. Newspapers claimed that the admiral had fallen in gallant combat against overwhelming numbers. The Japanese Navy preserved his uniform, his pistol, and fragments of his aircraft, turning them into relics of national endurance. Yet within the officers' mess halls, men spoke quietly of the strange precision of the American intercept. Some whispered that the enemy had mastered a new kind of divination, a machine that could read the airwaves of fate. Meanwhile, in a locked room at Pearl Harbor, Navy cryptanalysts kept working the same ciphers, their machines clicking day and night. The desks were plain pine, the same kind used to ship Coca-Cola bottles to the front. On one of those desks lay a scrap of paper with a simple formula scribbled across it, an equation of time, speed, and distance. Beside it was a single notation, Yamamoto. A clerk swept it into a file folder and stamped it, declassified after 20 years. Time passed. The war ended. The P-38s were melted for scrap, their engines silenced, their aluminum reborn as peacetime refrigerators and passenger cars. The crates that had carried bottles and secrets alike were burned in village cookfires or left to rot in jungles that swallowed everything man made. It was not until 1947 that fragments of the story began to surface. A veterans magazine printed an anonymous account titled The Longest Lightning Flight, describing a mission so secret that we could not even speak its name. Letters poured in from readers who guessed at its meaning. Barber received one from an old squadron mate. They'll have to tell it someday. History can't live in a crate forever. He kept that letter folded in his wallet until his death. When the operation was finally declassified in Saidos, Knockout, 1957, the surviving pilots were middle-aged men with greying hair and quiet eyes. Reporters asked them about heroism, vengeance, and courage. Barber said only, "It wasn't vengeance, it was arithmetic." Mitchell added, "Our real weapon was not the airplane, it was information. and perhaps that was the truest epitaph of all. The world remembered the lightning, the jungle, the fallen admiral, but the true engine of that mission, the fragile paper folded inside an envelope, hidden behind soft drink crates on a sweating island, remained the unseen core of the story. In every war, there is noise and there is silence. Operation Vengeance had begun in silence, erupted in thunder, and returned to silence again. But if one stood long enough by the rusting runway at Guadalcanal, the wind still carried a faint echo, the whisper of twin engines and the rustle of paper. The sound of knowledge disguised as noise. The sound of a secret that had changed the world. By 1958, 15 years had passed since the jungle at Bougainville had swallowed the wreck of Admiral Yamamoto's bomber. The war had receded into newsreels and textbooks, but its ghosts still moved in quiet corners inside archives, among rusting aircraft bones, and in the minds of the men who had lived the mission that could not be spoken. In Washington, the Department of the Navy prepared to release a public summary of Operation Vengeance. The official version was brief, sanitized, and confident. It told of a daring interception based on field intelligence, carried out by the valor of American pilots. No mention of magic, no reference to cryptanalysis, and no hint that the war's most decisive manhunt had been born from the invisible machinery of information. In the windowless stacks of the Naval History Division, a single wooden crate sat on a steel shelf. Its sides were stamped faintly with the red letters Coca-Cola Export Corporation. Inside were files, marked Confidential Pacific Theater. Among them, tucked inside a folder labeled NTF 131755, was the original decrypt, the sheet of paper that had started everything. The typed lines were faint, the carbon ink turned grey with age, but the words still carried an electric charge. Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet Itinerary, April 18th. Bougainville Inspection. The coordinates beneath it were written in pencil, a human hand deciding the fate of history. The irony was sharp enough to taste. The object that had once hidden those orders, a crate built to carry sugar water, had survived when metal and flesh had not. The same crates had been stacked in mess tents and warehouses across the Pacific, indistinguishable from millions of others. Soldiers had sat on them, eaten from them, cursed them for splinters, never knowing that one had carried the secret that changed the war's tide. When the files were unsealed for the press, the men who had flown the mission were invited to Washington. Major John W. Mitchell arrived in a plain grey suit, carrying the same measured composure he had shown in war. Rex Barber, older but still lean, stood beside him. The press cameras flashed, and one reporter asked the question every man had waited years to hear. "Major, how did you know where to find Yamamoto?" Mitchell looked straight into the lights. "We didn't know," he said quietly. "We calculated." The audience laughed lightly, mistaking modesty for humor. But those who had been there understood what he meant. The calculation had not been simple arithmetic. It had been the translation of stolen radio waves into longitude and latitude, hours and minutes, probability and death. After the ceremony, Barber lingered near a display case that contained the model of a P-38 and a single glass Coca-Cola bottle recovered from Guadalcanal. The curator had placed them side by side, unaware of their connection. Barber smiled faintly. "They should have put paper in there too," he murmured. That was the real bomb. Outside, Washington hummed with post-war normalcy. Cars rolled down Constitution Avenue, the Capitol dome gleamed, and tourists bought soda from street vendors who had never known a world at war. Barber took a bottle, drank slowly, and felt the faint sting of carbonation on his tongue. The taste pulled him back through time to the damp air of the Solomon Islands, the rattle of the crate beside the fuel drums, and the realization that sometimes the most ordinary things carry the greatest consequences. In Japan, that same year, an American delegation visited the site of Yamamoto's crash for a joint memorial. The jungle had reclaimed nearly everything. Only fragments of aluminum and a section of wing root remained. A Japanese officer, who had been a young cadet in 1943, laid a wreath and whispered, "He died for honor. You killed him for necessity." Perhaps that is the difference between us." American historian standing beside him replied softly, "No, we killed him for information." The officer looked up, confused. The historian pointed toward the jungle canopy. The same kind of information that told him Pearl Harbor would succeed, and that told us how to end him. The code was the true battlefield. That night, as the memorial torches burned and the jungle insects hummed, the two men shared silence, the language of soldiers who had both served different gods, but the same war. By the time the last official secrets were declassified in 1962, the world had already entered another age of intelligence, one of satellites and circuits. Yet the lesson of Operation Vengeance remained inscribed not in textbooks, but in the invisible fabric of every future war, that the mightiest weapon is not the bullet, the bomb, or the machine, but the quiet sentence on a hidden page, waiting to be read by someone who knows how. The crate still rests in a warehouse at the PARS, National Archives, its wood darkened with time. Inside lies the original decrypt, yellow with age, and a faded label from the Coca-Cola Export Corporation. On the margin, written in pencil by an unknown hand, are 3 words that summarize everything the operation proved. Paper beats steel. And in those words lives the echo of an age when thunder was measured not in decibels, but in data, when victory traveled inside a crate built for bottles, and the sound of a coded message changed the course of the Pacific War forever.